Thank you very much. It's great to be here and great to see we've got such a great turnout, and I do apologise for bringing the weather with me from Melbourne. I'll try and take it back with me, I promise, but no guarantees. All right, we'll just flip this over to there. All right, so let's get this going. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today about nanoparticles. So you've probably heard a little bit about these in the news and various discussions that have occurred. So I'll give you a little bit of an outline because this is a bit of a long one. So I'll try and be as interesting as I can and keep the science nice and understandable and accessible. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an intro into nanotechnology and talk about what it's all about. We'll talk about what nanoparticles are and where we find them. We'll talk about them in sunscreens, of course, because that's what we're all interested in hearing about today. What the concerns were around nanomaterials, a bit about the tolerance of nanomaterials by cells of the body, whether they can get into the body is, of course, very important. The sun and how the sun and nanoparticles and how those features relate to DNA damage. And we'll wrap it up and we'll take some questions. So let's jump into it. I'm going to do this as a series of questions. And the first of those is, what's this nanotechnology stuff all about? You've probably heard about it, but you probably don't have a good feel for what it is. And it's actually a hard thing to encompass because it's a lot of different things together. So there's a lot of IT and computer technology that is at the nanoscale. There's a lot of medical applications. There's an awful lot of manufacturing. And, of course, you get a lot of nanomaterial in nature. So basically what we're talking about is objects that are 1/billionth of a metre, or 1/millionth of a millimetre, if you want to look at it that way. So very, very small objects. So nanoparticles in particular are powders, dust, crystals that are present at this scale. So nature is actually very good at making things at this level. So all the proteins of your body work at this sort of scale, and lots of fragments of dust and exhaust from volcanoes and things like that are all at this scale. And of course we can make them as well. So we as I've said before about nanotechnology, similarly from nanoparticles, we can use them for diagnostics. A lot of work in this for X-rays, making X-rays better, that sort of thing. There is some experimental stuff on using nanoparticles in cancer treatment in various ways. And of course, beauty and skincare has been an area where there's always been a lot of nanoparticles. Usually where you see that sort of shininess to a particular cosmetic product, that can often indicate the presence of a nanoparticle. And of course we use them in paints and fuels. Now keep in mind that these are not all the same nanoparticles, these are all different nanoparticles. So we're talking about very different materials, a big class of different materials. And they are everywhere. And sometimes we even make them without meaning to. So if you can imagine if you're trying to make a very small particle, it's a bit like, say you were trying to make wood chips. So you put your wood through the chipper and you get out your chips, but you also get a quantity of sawdust. And it's a bit like that with nanostructures. So if I want to make particles, I usually start with a big thing and I grind it up and make it into smaller things. And what I invariably get when I grind something down is very small pieces. So we've actually had nanoparticles popping up for quite a long time. And of course, these are all very different materials and they have very different properties. So you can't really talk about all nanoparticles. It doesn't make much sense. You have to talk about specific ones. So clearly, I'm talking about tiny robots, right? Well, you've probably seen things like this. Little tiny robots running around the blood, dealing with cancer or disease and that sort of thing. This is not what we're talking about. This is not what we can do. This is not what the science is able to do. It's sometimes what people think we're close to, but we're not really. I'll show you more where we are and where more something like this. So this is state-of-the-art research. We can make a bike chain, okay? So not a tiny robot, we can make a bike chain. And in fact, there was a big ongoing debate about this, about how you might go about actually getting the bike chain to move. So this is perhaps sometimes what the perception is of little robots, but bike chains is really where it's at, and that's even pushing your luck a little bit. So the things we're talking about are much simpler things. So the particles that we're talking about, so particularly in sunscreens, are essentially just small, in this case you can see these small spheres, quite small objects, or these little sort of crystalline looking things. So small powders and objects, very simple structures. They don't do anything other than exist, and they have particular properties because they're very small. Okay, so how small are they? I mean, you don't really get a feel for it. I mean, I said a millionth of a millimetre, but that doesn't really mean anything to anyone. That could be, any size. You don't really have a sense of scale for there. So let's have a look at some other stuff. So these up top here, we've got the small parts of your lungs, the very bottom bits of your lungs, the alveoli. So they're up here near a millimetre, so too big. Neurons, they're your brain cells, too big. Pollens are still a bit big. Hair, too big. Bacteria are getting close, almost. They're still a little bit big. Your cells, again, a bit too big. If we get down to viruses, we're starting to get into the right sort of size category. And we've got DNA down here, that's about the right size. Particles from combustion, so exhaust particles. And then smaller things like soot. And if we start talking about atoms and elements and that sort of thing, we're actually talking too small. So these things are much bigger than atoms and chemicals and all that sort of thing. So in a typical nanoparticle, you might find the sort you might use in a sunscreen. You might find in one of those blobs that you just saw before, one of those spheres, you might see about 1 million to 10 million atoms of the material. So we're certainly not down at this level. So, yeah, okay. That was lots of things that you didn't really have a feel for the scale for anyway. All right, so let's break it down a bit more. All right, so here's our nanoparticles. Let's take one of our nanoparticles and compare it to the width of one of the hairs off your head. Okay? So, say we make the nanoparticle as big as the tennis ball. So this means the hair would be as wide as the whacker. Okay, so it's a big hair, and you'd have a lot of trouble throwing the nanoparticle across it, unless you're a really good thrower. So that's the sort of thing we're thinking of. But again, this tennis ball is still 1 million atoms in total, and it's probably about 300 across. So we're still not talking about atoms. Atoms are tiny. An atom would be about as big as my laser pointer dot compared to this thing. So again, different sorts of scales, different things. Now, I've talked about the nanoparticles being very different from each other, and I've talked about them sort of being chalk and cheese. You can't really compare them all. So, but I've said they're everywhere, but they can't really be everywhere, can they? Well, how about chalk? Chalk. Chalk has nanomaterial. That's interesting. There's a very fine material in there. And, well, we're talking about chalk. Let's talk about cheese. So, cheese. Oh, here we go. Lots of nanomaterial in cheese. So, particularly particulate material in cheese. So you see lots of these structures. But it's not just things that you interact with and things that you might eat, of course. It's also in things you breathe. So in a typical air sample, you get lots of this little stuff. So you've got your sort of larger dust-type particles, and you've got your droplets and your condensation. But down here, this big lump is all nanoparticles. So this is stuff that your body deals with on a day-to-day basis. So there's nothing inherently special about this. It's just stuff that your body encounters all the time. All right, so we've established that. Let's talk about the ones that we can make. So that's new technology, right? That's new stuff. Cutting edge. We've talked about nanomaterials. You hear about it in the news. It's all great, all fancy and new. Or is it not really? Because this is a Roman cup from the 4th century. Now you'll see all these lovely colours here. Now what they've done here, what the Romans did, was they imbued the material with nanoparticulate gold. And if you make gold nanoparticles of different sizes, they come out different colours. So they could create these beautiful cups where they could put a candle flame inside, and you could get these beautiful colours coming out. And that's actually nanotechnology. It's very old nanotechnology. They probably didn't exactly know what they were doing, but gee, they did some good stuff. So we use nanoparticles now in a lot of consumer type products. Some of these uses are good, some of them are bad. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the uses of silver in this case, just to give you a bit of a range. So silver's been used in lots of stuff. This is silver nanoparticles. We've got some good uses of silver in these. These are actually antimicrobial wound dressings, especially for burns and things. And silver's really good at killing bacteria, which is why it makes a really good bandage. However, as with anything, as soon as you put antimicrobial on a product, everyone wants to sell it everywhere. So it's been put into fridges, washing machines, pillows, and of course teddy bears, because everyone needs an antimicrobial teddy bear. Of course they don't. And it's really a trivial use of the material. Silver, if we're going to use this to get rid of bacteria in wounds, then we don't want to be putting it in silly things like teddy bears, because then the bacteria become resistant and it doesn't work so well. And I've even seen it in sillier things like socks, where as soon as they go through the washing machine, it's all gone anyway. So I wonder what the point is. All right, so where do sunscreens fit into all this? Let's get back on topic a little bit. We've established what nanoparticles are and aren't, so let's get back on topic. So sunscreens, the nanoparticles used in sunscreens come in two varieties. One of them is zinc oxide, and one of them is titanium. Now, these are different from the chemicals that are normally used in the traditional sunscreens, although you're probably thinking, well, zinc's been around a while, and you're right. We've been using zinc for a long time in sunscreens. Okay, why these are interesting from a consumer point of view and also from a manufacturing point of view is because they don't actually break down under UV like the chemicals, which is a bit of an advantage. They actually have to rub off. They also tend to be quite broad spectrum, which is very important. We'll talk about a little bit more about that in a little while. So, broad spectrum, let's go into that. So these are, don't worry too much about what these things are, but these ones up here are all the chemical ones, and you can see they cover different amounts of the UV range. This is UVB, this is the one that burns your skin, and UVA, which is the bigger bit, is the one that causes photoaging and some other nasty things that we'll talk about a little bit more later. So you'll see that they cover different ranges, and when you get a chemical sunscreen, it's got different ones formulated in, so you get the full range if it's a broad spectrum sunscreen. Now down here we have titania, that's the one I talked about before, so that covers most of it, but there's a bit of a gap, so you've got to sort of usually put it in with this one. And zinc oxide, which very nicely covers the entire spectrum, which makes it a good product, and that's why the traditional white zinc cream has always been a good sunscreen. Okay, so why nano? I mean, zinc's fine, but why make it nano? Well, this is what you can do. This is traditional zinc cream, nice white paste, great at blocking the sun. And that's kind of that blue line there. You can see that this is how much light gets through. This is none, this is all of it. So this is the UV. So you see it blocks the UV and then it appears white because not much of the light gets through, it all gets reflected, it's white. Now, as we go down in scale, something's happening. You can see that it's still keeping the UV, but suddenly the light's starting to get through as we go down. And if we get to this sort of size, suddenly it's transparent. Ta-da! That's fantastic because it now looks like this. So you can go to the beach and you can have your wonderful zinc sunscreen and you can rub it all over yourself and not look like some sort of crazy clown. Okay. So let's get on to broad spectrum. Now we're going to do a little bit of skin science here. That's okay. This is a cross section of a piece of skin. Don't worry, they don't normally come purple. We just stain them that way so we can see what's going on. This is the top of the skin. This is the dead bit. That's the dead skin on top. Here's the last bit of the growing skin at the epidermis. And down here is the basal cells. So this is kind of where the cancers form. So UVB smacks into that, right into that layer. Not fantastic. UVA gets even further, which is in some ways worse. But together, you can see that they're a pretty bad combination. If they stop further up, that would be much nicer. They get through. they cause cancer, we need a sunscreen, and a broad spectrum sunscreen. Okay, so that's what nanoparticles are, that's what you use them for, but the big question still remains, are they safe? All right. Well, what have these concerns been? Okay, the first one has been that they might somehow be toxic, so we'll talk about that a little bit first. The second one is that they produce free radicals when you leave them in the sun. Now, this is particularly true of one type of titania called anatase, and to a lesser extent the zinc oxide. And the reason this started is that it was found that when you left some of the nanoparticles in the sun on different types of paint, you could damage the paint. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the particles had to be left there for quite a long time for this damage to occur. But yeah, I said, Anna, what am I talking about? Two types of titania. Well, I'll give you a little bit of a background into this because we're going to come back to it. So titania comes in two flavours. Two main flavours. It actually comes in 3 flavours, but we're only going to talk about 2 because they're the ones that are generally used. So this form called anatase is actually primarily an industrial catalyst. It's the sort of thing that you use sometimes as a paint setter, and there's some other applications of fuel catalysts as well, occasionally, I think. It produces significant amounts of free radicals in the sun. It's not a fantastic material to use in a sunscreen. There's another form, a little bit more, you can see it's a little bit different how it looks. This one's much less photoactive. It tends to contain a bit of that, but it's clearly the better material for a sunscreen. I just wanted to bring that up because I'm going to come back to it soon. But back to the point, we're talking about toxicity. So, zinc and titanium. Dangerous metals? Well, without a bit of background, sometimes it's hard to tell whether a metal is going to be dangerous or not. Zinc is probably should be a little obvious, but let's go through it. Okay, so zinc. What have we been doing with zinc over the years? Well, we're quite happy to put it on babies. There's nappy rash cream. Now, this is not nanoparticle zinc. This is what we call bulk zinc. But remember, this is the wood chipper still. So when we make bulk zinc like this, we probably still have a fraction of nanoparticles. I'm not going to say there are definitely nanoparticles in this product because I haven't tested this product, but in a lot of these materials there will be. Okay, we're quite happy to eat zinc. We're quite happy with that, zinc supplements, and of course the zinc cream we've been using for a very long time. And of course zinc is part of your body. It's one of the more common metals in your body, and your body uses zinc for all sorts of enzymes, and it uses it to build DNA, and it uses it to build cells. And zinc is very well handled by the body. Now titanium's a little bit different. Titanium's a little bit more foreign to the body, but it's a metal that we use a lot in medicine. In particular, we use it for joint replacements. So we use it for hips, and we use it for teeth, and all sorts of other joints. And we've been doing this a long time, and we know that titanium metal is well tolerated by the body in this respect. You might have heard that there has been a few recent problems with titanium, and a lot of that has been due to the usual thing of people using industrial grade material rather than medical grade material. If you have pure titanium, it works fine. If you use industrial grade rubbish, then you get problems, but it's not actually from the titanium, it's from other metals contaminating the titanium. Okay, so what happens when you put these things at the nanoscale? What happens when you turn them into nanoparticles? All right, so I've been going on about this a little bit, about incidental nanoparticles, and I just wanted to reinforce again that if I put zinc through a wood chipper, I get big bits of zinc and I get little bits of zinc. So this sample is sold as a bulk zinc sample, and you'll see that there's lots of nanomaterial in there. So this sort of nanomaterial has always been there. It's in the zinc supplements you eat. It's probably in the creams, the bulk zinc creams you rub on your skin. It's all over the place. All right, so let's talk about how well these things are tolerated by cells. Okay, so we have found that when you make them at the nanoscale, they're not tolerated as well. But that is as a function of surface area. So as the surface area increases, the body doesn't tolerate the material as well. But it doesn't go crazy. It's not like you get to nanoscale and everything gets crazily toxic and you don't know what's going on, you can track it exactly, and you can actually calculate what your tolerance level is going to be based on your surface area. So nothing special seems to happen when we make these things nano-sized. Okay, and not forgetting that these materials are pretty well tolerated to begin with, and generally what we've found, so are the nanomaterials. Now there are always exceptions. There's no blanket cases in all this. So what has also been found is that if you aerosolize some of these things, the tolerance goes down a little bit. So breathing in particles, probably not a fantastic idea. Breathing in chemicals, not a good idea either. Try not to breathe things in, especially concentrated things. All right. So in our research, we've exposed cells of the immune system to different types of particles. Now, the reason we do this in skin cells as well, but the reason why we're doing this in immune cells is because immune cells, or these type of immune cells we're using, are scavengers, so they'll suck up all the material around them. And that's their role in the body, is to clear out the debris, clear out particles. So we can load them up with a really enormous dose of particles, and we can find out what happens. And we can compare different types of particles. We can compare things that are nano to things that aren't nano. So what do we find? So let's stick with silver, because we've been doing some comparisons to silver. So silver, we tested silver, and we found that the zinc oxide nanoparticles were tolerated 100 times better than the silver. That means we could crank the zinc up to 100-fold greater than we could the silver before we started to see some problems. The titania was quite amazing. That's 50,000 times better tolerated than the silver. In fact, in these experiments, there's so much titania in with the cells, it actually looks like they're growing in white paint. It's actually quite hard to believe they're still alive in there, but they seem to be not only alive, but quite healthy. So the titania is really biologically ignored. The cells don't seem to interact with it. Now, we know silver's used in bandages, so we're pretty happy that silver's okay. We also know that you can drink silver until you are blue in the face. So here's a poor chap that was drinking nanoparticulate silver 3 times a day for 15 years. Now, what he's managed to do is turn himself purple. So basically what happens is the nanoparticulate silver gathers under the skin, and then when you go out in the sun, you develop like a photograph. So he'll continue to get darker the more he goes out in the sun now. Unfortunately for him, we can't fix this. The good news is there's nothing actually wrong with him other than being purple. So he hasn't managed to poison himself, even though he drank a truly enormous amount of silver over a very long time. He's merely purple. In fact, if he goes back out in the sun for a bit longer now, he might be able to get himself darker and get himself more towards a more natural shade, rather than going through the various degrees of purpleness. Okay. But you're probably asking at this stage, okay, they're small, all right, they don't seem to be too toxic, but what if lots of them get into the body? Is that going to be a problem? So they can get through the skin, can they? Are they small enough to get through the skin? No, not quite small enough. Turns out there's been a lot of people that have looked at this, and they've been trying really, really hard to show they get through the skin. In fact, I saw one study where they were doing 15 minutes of shiatsu massage after putting nanoparticles on their hands just to see if they could force some through the skin. And even that doesn't work particularly well. It turns out if you do 15 minutes of shiatsu massage with nanoparticles all over your hands, you can get a little bit to go in, but that's pretty extreme. They did show that you do get a little bit in the hair follicles that can build up, but it doesn't seem to be able to get across the hair follicle, which is really good. And even if the skin's damaged, or if you've got some shedding skin from psoriasis, and there were a lot of groups that went, oh yeah, okay, we'll put it on skin of people with psoriasis and measure it that way, because that's skin that's coming off, maybe it's a bit thinner. Well, that doesn't work either. The skin is very good at keeping things out. Okay. That said, if you look at the smaller size of titanium that's used, you do see a little bit in, but it doesn't make it down to that important bit. So I want to show you that again. There's also one study that shows that some zinc can get in. But because of the design of the study, they couldn't actually... Is my phone interfering with that? They couldn't actually show whether it was nanoparticles or just zinc. And that's... A lot of these studies are designed poorly like that, and it can be very hard to tell. It can be sort of like finding a nanoparticle in a haystack, if you like. So, the skin. Let's get back to our skin diagram. So we saw that UVB gets down to this important basal layer where the cancers form. UVA gets right through that and gets down to there. Zinc doesn't, in nanoparticle form, doesn't appear to go anywhere. It just stays in the dead layer. And the nanoparticulate titanium seems to just get past the dead layer, but just into these guys. Now, these guys are slowly progressing outwards and will eventually become this dead layer. So these guys are doomed anyway, essentially. So this is where the action is in the stem cells. So these are the ones that are dividing and pushing these guys out. So the nanotitania doesn't seem to get down to where the real damage occurs. Certainly doesn't get down all the way here. Right, so, okay. Let's assume I'm wrong. Let's assume I've got no idea what I'm talking about. They all get in, blah-de-blah. Okay, fine. I was obviously forgetting all those papers that I read where they did get in. Well, I wasn't, but there aren't any. Okay, so but, one way to handle this is to go, let's not worry about how many get in. Let's assume there was no skin. Let's let them all in and see what happens. But we're going to need a little bit of background for this first. So let's talk about DNA damage. Okay, the sun has lots of damage, lots of ways of inflicting DNA damage on you. It can directly change or break the DNA. It can cause mutation in it. It can also do this indirect damage in the form of free radical formation. It can form things like peroxides that can damage DNA as well. So it has all these different mechanisms of damaging DNA. And we know that UV-induced DNA damage has been shown to lead to cancer. Without a doubt, we know this. As an extra kicker, UVA has also got an effect where it suppresses the immune system. So you've got all this damage going on, and then your immune system gets suppressed. So that kind of stinks and is a very good reason why you should be wearing a sunscreen that blocks UVA. Okay, let's have a look at nanoparticles. Nanoparticles don't do most of that. These small studies that show that they can damage objects in the sun show that they will produce free radicals. Free radicals will damage DNA, without a doubt. Free radicals do damage DNA. However, sunscreen nanoparticles have not been shown to cause cancer. You might be saying, but hang on, didn't you just say they damage DNA? Doesn't DNA damage cancer? Yes and no, but it's more no than yes. Most of the time, when your cell's DNA is damaged, and your cells are experiencing DNA damage all the time, not only whenever you go out into the sun, but with exposure to all sorts of things. Usually the DNA is either repaired or the cell dies. These are the usual outcomes, the things that are going on in your body every day. Now, the DNA damage that actually leads to cancer is a very rare event. That's not to say that cancer is, a very rare event, because lots of people get cancer, but of the number of times that your DNA is damaged, it's a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of cells that go on to cause cancer. And in some people's lifetimes, that never happens. So you can go through your entire life having DNA damage for your entire life and never get cancer. But some people do. And it's about these specific changes. It's about requiring multiple changes and multiple specific changes, which is why DNA damage itself is not enough. But you're still probably saying, I'm still worried about these free radicals. You're still telling me they damage DNA. I want to see it. I want to see how much damage. Okay? Let's say the skin doesn't stop them. Let's take some of our immune cells that we've been playing with, dose them up, get them to suck up as many nanoparticles as we can, And then what we're going to do is we're going to put them in the sun. We're going to put them in a little chamber that simulates sunlight, and we're going to blast them with sunlight, and we're going to see how much of these free radicals are made. This is what we get. So, first one. This is what happens if you just blast them with sunlight. So we've just called this 100%, just so it's a little bit easier to understand. So it's actually quite a bit. It actually goes up about 7 or 8-fold from what they were before you belted them with sunlight. Now, if we put some zinc oxide nanoparticles in with them, and we've basically dispersed, we've used just the sunscreen component. We haven't used the formulated sunscreen, so we've mixed up just the nanoparticles. So it's not as a sunscreen, it's all mixed up. We've sort of blended it. We can see that we don't actually get any increase. We actually get a slight decrease. And in fact, if we use the rutile titanium, we actually get about half as much free radical production as we do if we didn't put anything in there. And what that's telling us is the titanium, even though it's all broken up, it's still a pretty good sunscreen. It's still acting like a sunscreen, even though it's now dissolved into a little well. It's still doing quite well. Now, the anatase, remember I was talking about I didn't like that one very much, and this is probably the reason why it's not a fantastic material. You'll see that it's causing about twice as much free radical production as sunlight alone. So we don't like this guy. We don't think he should be in sunscreen, and generally he's not. This guy, on the other hand, is a different story. So this is not to say that nanoparticles aren't producing free radicals for this situation. They absolutely are. But the thing is, they're absorbing more from sunlight than they're producing. Okay? So the net effect is that even when they're not in a sunscreen, you've got half as much free radicals as you started with. And let's get some perspective. You'll see the last column. You'll see the last column, how it extends up and up and up and up. Well, I've rescaled this for you. So that's the sort of thing we're looking at. So this is a peroxide solution. This is the relative amount of free radicals. You'll see this is 700% of UV. Okay? Now, peroxide solutions. Okay, so you really don't want to go near the free radicals. You're worried about them. But you probably already know where this is going now because I was just talking about peroxide solutions, wasn't I? So, it's always your choice. You can choose what products you're exposed to. But the same DNA damage that's caused by these particles and is one, but only one small component of the DNA damage caused by sunlight. Now, important to remember, it's only one component, is in these sorts of products. So, whitening toothpaste, any hair dye that lightens, any sort of peroxide-based hair dye, those products actually contain significant peroxides. So, and the exposure levels you've seen are very, very much higher than the levels you're getting with nanoparticles. Now, please don't run off and think that your hair dye is going to give you cancer. It's not. Okay? These are products that have been used for a long time without any known cancer-associated risks. But they do damage DNA, and your body seems to handle that just fine. And they damage DNA a lot more than the particles do in the sun. So, you're probably thinking, maybe I'm just an advocate, maybe I think all nanomaterials are safe and they're all wonderful. Of course they're not. It's case by case. These are individual things, chalk and cheese again. Some nanomaterials we are concerned about. Some we are looking at very, very carefully. One of these is carbon nanotubes. So carbon nanotubes have properties that are, well, let's qualify again. Some carbon nanotubes have properties that are very similar to asbestos fibres. Now, if any of you know anything about asbestos, you'll also know that not all asbestos fibres are created equal. There's bad ones and there's really bad ones. And there's also ones that aren't so bad. Still not great, but not so bad. So some of these nanotube materials seem to behave something like the asbestos fibres, and that has us really concerned. So these are things we're looking into. So you can see that we don't make a blanket assumption on this. We don't just go, nanomaterials safe. Because they're such different materials, you've got to assess them on a case-by-case basis. You've really got to look into each one, see what it's like, see what it's not like, work out whether it's going to cause any problems. So let's move on a little bit. Nano labeling. Should we stick a nano label on stuff? Now, you're probably getting a feel at the moment that this might not be a straightforward issue. On one hand, you can go, okay, well, you put nano on it, and everyone's informed, and that's great because consumers have a choice, everyone's happy. But you've got to be a little bit careful even with that, because you go, well, if I go, now with the goodness of nanoparticles, that's very different from saying warning contains nanoparticles. So already you can create a message just through your label. Now, it gets even trickier. It's a good thing to stay informed. It's good to know these things. But what about the natural nanoparticles? What about the ones that were in there anyway that I didn't know about because they were part of some other ingredient, and I didn't, run every single thing I used through very sophisticated scientific testing just to work out whether I forgot about a nanoparticle that was always in there anyway. We just had never looked at it. And then we have the incidental ones. So should I label it if it was, say, a bulk zinc cream and it just happened to have 5% nanoparticles in it? I mean, do I have to work that out? I mean, that's the sawdust again. I tried to make a zinc particle. I ended up with some sawdust. Should I be counting the sawdust? Should I be leaving it out? Importantly, if I'm going to label it, and if everything has nanostructure and nanoparticles in there anyway, am I getting any value out of the label? Does it mean anything anymore? Or am I actually misinforming people? Because if I put nano on something and there was something else in there I didn't know about that had nanoparticles, because that's pretty likely anyway, I'm actually misinforming people, because now the products that aren't labelled nano have nano. And the ones that, well, yeah, you can see how this is really a convoluted issue. It's not simple. Okay, let's start wrapping it up. Are we going to have more nano stuff? Well, yeah, we are. We'll get more nano stuff. As more uses are discovered, more new materials, more interesting materials, the use will continue to grow. And we'll continue to assess these materials on a case-by-case basis. We'll continue to develop tools where we can look at them in great detail, continue to assess whether they are good or bad materials. So these are going to be in all sorts of things. They're going to be in agriculture, food science, medicine, all those things we're talking about. 3D printers are coming. Pretty soon everyone will have a little microwave in their kitchen, and they'll be able to zap up, a picnic set. And out will come a picnic set in 10 minutes. Or, a pair of thongs. get out a pair of plastic thongs. And they will be using nanotechnology significantly. And of course, computing has always used nanotechnology. I think they're down to very, very small wires now that are only a few tens of nanometers across. So all this stuff is coming. A lot of it's here already. But we're not going to get little robots. We're not going to have little robots for a very long time. We might get little nano shrubbery, though. Nano shrubbery is always nice. Not very useful, but always nice. All right, so let's wrap it up. The quick version. All right, that was a lot of stuff to get through. Let's go through it quickly, just to wrap up. So, zinc oxide and titania, materials that are well tolerated by the body. When you put them in nanoparticulate form, this seems to be still the case. They're still well tolerated. Nothing drastic changes. Penetration of nanoparticles through the skin is negligible, so it probably doesn't make a lot of difference whether they're well tolerated or not, even though they are, because they don't really get through the skin. And it probably shouldn't be that surprising, because if you remember from our second slide, that chart where I showed the size of different things, remember that these things are approximately the same size as viruses. And the skin is impervious to viruses. Viruses do not get in. So an object of the same size is not likely to get in. Now the big difference is, of course, if you have a little cut and one virus gets in, it can then contaminate your entire body. Nanoparticle, of course, can't do that. It's just a particle. It can't do anything other than sit there. So if you did have a little abrasion, you get a little bit of material in, but as we've seen, even if you get a lot of material in, the effects are quite minor. Okay, we do get free radical generation, but the free radical generation is quite small compared to UVA. and very small compared to the free radicals you'd be exposed to from using peroxide-based products, things like that. So in other words, again, nothing new here. This is stuff you've been exposed to for years and years. And the most important thing is that nanoparticles have not been shown to cause cancer. Sunlight has been shown to cause cancer. This is the most important thing. So, you're going to ask me what I'd recommend. I really don't want to recommend anything because I'd like you to have listened to what I've said and to formulate your own opinions. And I know that can be very, very hard with science sometimes because people always want to give you opinions rather than information. And sometimes there's so much information that it can be hard to process. So I'm going to help a little bit. This is what you should do. You should wear a broad spectrum sunscreen. You should always do that. I've gone through all the reasons why that's very important because the sun is the thing that is going to give you cancer. Okay, good broad spectrum sunscreens. Zinc. Zinc is a fantastic broad spectrum sunscreen, and whether it's white paste or nano, it's still good in either configuration. Zinc oxide supplemented with chemicals can also be done with some of the chemical blockers that are normally used, and the same titanium you'll find is always formulated with some of the chemical blockers. If you remember, it doesn't quite cover the whole range, so you always get some in there. That said, a broad spectrum chemical sunscreen, one of the traditional ones, is still great protection from the sun. So you have a choice. You always have a choice. A few caveats. If you have sensitive skin, the chemicals tend to be a little bit more irritating to sensitive skin, so sometimes the metal-based ones are a bit better. And we don't like the idea of spray-ons. Making particles, all chemicals, into aerosols and inhaling them is generally not a fantastic idea, so we think they should best be avoided. And there's no real reason why you can't rub the stuff on anyway. Okay, which brings us to the end. Just like to acknowledge my colleagues at RMIT and Monash in our various research groups, and of course Cancer Council of Western Australia for bringing me out here and giving me a chance to talk to you all. And if you want more information, you can go to our NanoSafe Australia website or the Cancer Council's website, where there'll be plenty of stuff on nanoparticles and UV respectively. And thank you very much for your attention.